Okay, so I'm back, and in the last video this is the result that we came up with. We took the texture, we made it look nice with some bump mapping, and we added this nice dirt map to it that makes it look much better using that cavity map that we set up in the Hypershade. And if we go back to the Hypershade, we can quickly see this is what we had. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to add a mental ray node called the Ambient Occlusion node, and we're going to use that to create this nice effect of contact shadows wherever this texture or this terrain meets up with any other geometry in the scene. In this case, things like the tin can, these wooden posts, and these little pebbles and this large stone or these other large stones all over our scene. Because right now we can see that here's where the terrain texture ends, and then the rock is right there. What we're going to do is we're going to darken that area up to make it look grittier and a little bit nastier. It's not going to be very realistic looking, but it's going to give us a nice dirty look to this scene, which is exactly what we're going for here. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that in this video and get that done. What I need to do is go back to the Hypershade here. Let me go ahead and maybe expand the size of this out a little bit more, and I'm going to go ahead and open up the Create toolbar over here. And we don't want to use Maya nodes, because what we're going to do is grab ourselves a node that is specific to mental ray. So we need to go up here to where it says Create Maya nodes, and this time we're going to switch to Create mental ray nodes. So once we switch to mental ray nodes, we have all these different little categories of nodes. What we want to do is go to the textures category, and you're going to see a node here called MIB Ambient Occlusion. Okay, so let's go ahead and just click on that once. That's going to drop it right here in the Hypershade. And let's go ahead and hide the Create toolbar there, and we'll click on the Rearrange Graph button up here. Again, that's the one with the 3 little squares on the top and the 3 little yellow squares on the bottom. Okay, so we'll hit A, and here's everything that we have. Here's the new Ambient Occlusion node. The Ambient Occlusion node, if you go ahead and open up its attribute editor, has a few options here, and we're going to go over some of these options so you understand what's going on and how to use it. And basically the way that this node works is it's going to sample the environment, and it's going to basically say, okay, these two objects are very close to each other, therefore I'm going to darken the area up around the proximity of where the two objects meet. So if you had a rock on top of terrain, the area where the rock and terrain meet, that general area is going to be darkened up a bit, and it's going to have this kind of like a dirtier, grimier look to it. Okay, it's not going to be too realistic, but it is going to add that nice artistic feel to it that makes it look a little bit grittier and a little bit darker. Okay, and you can control the distance of that using this max distance parameter, and we'll see that in a moment. So we'll see it in actual practice. So let me close that. So now the question is, how in the world do I plug this into this node here, into this graph? How do I make room for this Ambient Occlusion node to fit into this graph and work properly? Well, if I go over here to the Lambert shader, again, I have all these different parameters here like transparency, the ambient color, incandescence, diffuse, translucence, but I don't really have anywhere where I could plug in the Ambient Occlusion node. I mean, it could be plugged into things like the color, you could plug it into the ambient color, you could plug it into a bunch of different places, even the reflection if you wanted to, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, what I'm going to do is create myself a few custom nodes and rearrange this stuff in a different manner so that it can composite on top of each other. Basically, what I want to do is something similar to what I did here with the cavity map and the color map and how I composited them using the layer texture node here. I'm going to do a similar setup, but I can't do it with the layer texture node, so I'm going to have to come up with a creative solution to this problem. And what I'm going to do is actually something pretty simple here. I'm going to need a couple of extra nodes. Okay, I'm going to need a surface node so that I can plug in the information from this Ambient Occlusion node to the surface node. And I'm also going to need another node that's going to create a little bit of a mathematical function. Alright, and it won't make sense at first, but it'll make sense once I set it up and I explain it to you why it's set up that way. Then it's going to make a lot of sense. So let's go ahead and set this up, and then you'll understand why I'm doing what I'm doing. Okay, so let's go back to the Create node toolbar over here, and we want to switch from mental ray nodes to Maya nodes. We're going to need a couple of Maya nodes here. We're going to need a surface shader, and I'll explain to you why we need that in a moment. So I'll create a surface shader here, which creates just this black surface shader, and we're also going to need to go down. So let's scroll down, and we want to scroll down to General Utilities here, and we want to grab ourselves a node that can create mathematical functions. Some nodes that can create mathematical functions are nodes like the average node here, which can take some different inputs and average them out. We can also use a set range node to change ranges and things like that. And we can also use this multiply divide node, which can actually multiply and divide different values. So we're going to go ahead and click on that to create it. Let's go ahead and hide that create toolbar there. And let's go ahead and click on Rearrange Graph here so we can rearrange this, make it look a little bit more organized. Let's bring these new nodes that we created, which is the multiply and divide node, the surface shader, and the ambient occlusion. Okay. So just try to bear with me here. This is probably not going to make sense at first. So just kind of open your mind, accept it for what it is, and then after all is said and done, then you'll think back and go, okay, so that's why he did that. So just hang in there and bear with me here. Here we go. I'm going to go ahead and double click on a multiply divide node to open up its attribute editor. Okay, now there's only basically 3 parameters that we can play around with, so it's not a very difficult node to use. Okay, basically all this node does is it works almost like a calculator. It works just like a calculator actually. Basically you choose an operation. You can choose to multiply or divide or power, but we're going to stick with multiply. Okay, so you can, for example, take 2 different values, an input 1 and an input 2, and you could tell it to multiply those values. Okay, so if you put in a value of say 1 here and put in a value of say 2 here, it would basically, if it's set to multiply, it's going to go, okay, this person, this 3D artist wants me to multiply 1 times 2, which would equal 2. And it would actually output that value, that sum, or that result. And you can then plug in that result into another shader to create another effect. Okay, so probably doesn't make sense right now, but it will in a moment. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to plug in a couple of nodes here for the input 1 and the input 2. So the question is, what in the world are we going to multiply or divide here using this node? Well, it's pretty simple. First thing we're going to do is set up the ambient occlusion here. Okay, the reason I created the surface shader is because the ambient occlusion node has to plug into something. Okay, it can't just sit there by itself in the middle of nowhere, not being plugged into something. And we can't just plug it into the Lambert node, and we can't plug it into the layered texture node over here. So what we're going to do is we're going to plug it into the surface shader. If we open up the surface shader, and we had a quick look at the surface shader in a previous video when I was discussing shading models with Maya shaders and Mentor shaders. You remember that one with all the little spheres and the different shaders? The surface shader is a very simple shader. It has an out color, which we can change, and you can also put an out transparency as well as an out glow color and matte opacity. Okay, right now we're really concerned with the out color right here. Alright, we want the ambient occlusion node to replace the out color here. So let's middle mouse button and drag the ambient occlusion node. Let's drop it right there. Might be a little bit hard to see there. Let me resize this the Hypershade here. And basically just middle mouse button and drag and drop the ambient occlusion node on top of the out color here in the attribute editor of the surface shader, so it plugs in. So let's close that attribute editor, and I'm going to hit A here in the Hypershade, and there we go. So now the surface shader's color is being controlled by the ambient occlusion, alright, which is going to make it turn completely black like so. So what I'm going to do is I need to take this surface shader here, which is now being controlled by ambient occlusion, and it has to plug somehow into this shading engine here, into the shading group that's right here. Okay, but it can't do that right now because the Lambert right now has control of that. If I open up the shading group here, go to the shading group tab, the surface material is being controlled by that Lambert 3, which is this one here. I can't just go ahead and replace it with the surface shader. It's not going to work. So I have to come up with some kind of ingenious solution to get this thing to all work together. So here's what I need to do. I'm going to go ahead and drag select this arrow. So basically I'm selecting this arrow here, this little green arrow that connects from the Lambert 3 to the shading group. I'm going to select that arrow and hit delete on the keyboard to cut that relationship. And you'll notice in the viewport the terrain turns green. That's because the terrain is not too happy right now that we cut that relationship. But that's not a problem. We're going to fix that a little bit later. Okay. Now this multiply divide node, again, if we open it up, we see that we have an input 1 and an input 2. What we're going to do is we're going to take the Lambert shader and we're going to plug that into the input 1, and we're going to take the surface shader, which is basically the ambient occlusion shader, and we're going to plug that into the input 2. So to do that very easily, we'll open up the attribute editor here for the multiply divide node. Make sure the operation is set to multiply, and we're going to go for the input 1 node. We're going to middle mouse button drag the Lambert 3 shader and plug it into the input 1. And now you'll get this connection editor window that pops up because Maya is not too sure what you're trying to do. So what we want to do is tell Maya to take the output from this Lambert 3 that's right here and plug it into that input 1 over here. So let's go ahead and tell Maya to do that. And doing that's actually pretty easy. You want to make sure you scroll down here. You have all these different parameters that you can plug in and out and stuff, and it could look a little bit overwhelming at first. Just kind of navigate down and try to find this out color parameter. Okay, click on it once to highlight it in blue, and then over here on the right, which is the inputs for the multiply divide node, what you want to do is click on input 1. That's it. You notice that the out color and the input 1 get turned into italicized. They turn to italics. Okay, then hit close, and you notice that now there's an arrow that connects, and if you hover over that arrow, you should get a little tooltip that pops up that says Lambert3.outColor, and then it says multiply divide 1.input 1. And I know that sounds kind of cryptic. It sounds really weird, almost like a robot is talking to you. That's just the way that Maya tries to interact with you. And basically what it means is that now the Lambert shader is being connected to the input 1 here of the multiply divide node, which is why the input here for input 1 turned yellow, okay, to let us know that that's what's happening, that the Lambert shader is now connected there. Okay, so now all we have to do is middle mouse button drag the surface shader, drop it on top of input 2. We're going to get the same thing again. We're going to get this this window that pops up, and right now we have the surface shader here. What we want to do is take that out color and plug it into the input 2. Okay, so there's the out color right there. Input 2, plug it in, close that window, and there we go. Now we can see we have an arrow right there as well. So now basically what's happening is the multiply and divide node is taking the result of this Lambert 3 and it's multiplying it by the ambient occlusion shader. So you're probably wondering, well, why in the world would you want to do that? Well, when we go ahead and do a test render, you're going to see why. Alright? Now what we need to do is we need to take the results of the multiply and divide node and plug that into the shading group. However, we're going to run into a problem. You can't plug the multiply divide node into the shading group because it's incompatible. It won't work. It's almost like trying to stick a pencil into a keyhole and expecting the door of your car to open. You have to stick the key from the door to be able to open. You can't just stick a pencil in there and hope for it to open. So we need to find the right key or the right type of node to plug into the shading group, and it cannot be the multiply divide node. So again, we run into another problem. How can we solve it? Well, we just have to be a little bit creative. To be able to pull this off is actually going to be pretty simple. What we need is another surface shader. A surface shader that can accept the multiply divide node's value and pipe that value over to the shading group over here. So we'll go back to the create toolbar over here. We'll scroll up and make sure you're using Maya nodes. And here in surface shader, just middle mouse button drag and drop right onto the Hypershade. Hide the create toolbar there. We don't need it for now. And what we want to do is go ahead and open up the attribute editor for the surface shader 2, which is the new one we created. And we want to plug in the multiply divide node into the out color up here. Okay, very similar to what we did with ambient occlusion. So middle mouse button drag and drop the multiply divide node from the Hypershade on top of the out color here for the surface shader. And it'll plug in automatically. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to go ahead and click on Rearrange Graph again. I'm going to hit A on the keyboard, and here's our graph. Our graph is a lot larger than it was before. Here's my shading group, okay? And here's the surface shader that's coming from the multiply divide. Now things are getting a little bit confusing because basically stuff isn't really being renamed properly. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to go to this Lambert shader here. I'm going to go to rename, and I want to rename that Lambert 3 shader. I'm going to call it result. And that's not some kind of iron rule. You don't have to, but that's just my way of doing it, because really this shader here is the result of the bump map and the compositing from the cavity map and the color map together. Okay, now the multiply divide node, I'm going to leave the name alone, that's perfectly fine, but the surface shader over here, I'm going to rename it. The surface shader, this one right here, not the ambient occlusion one, the one that's getting information from the multiply divide node, I'm going to rename this and I'm going to call it ground underscore mat, which is short for material. So that's the ground material itself. And now that's going to go into the shading group over here. So let's go ahead and open up the attribute editor here for the ground shading group by double clicking on it, and then middle mouse button drag and drop the ground material into the surface material slot here of the shading group. Perfect. So now everything is working perfectly. Everything can now work together. Initially, there was no way to hook all this stuff up together, but by using some creative thinking and some thinking outside the box and some of the nodes available to us in the Hypershade, we were able to go ahead and use things like the multiply divide node, some of these surface shaders to pipe information from one thing to the other, and eventually get all that stuff to pipe in directly into the shading group over here so that our shader, our network, would work properly. Okay, so now that we got everything plugged in correctly, we can start doing some test renders, and I can start showing you how this ambient occlusion node right here works. So I'll double click the ambient occlusion node in the Hypershade to open up its attribute editor. Make sure you go to list and turn auto load selected objects off, because or auto load selected attributes off, because it gets pretty annoying. So I'll take that off. I'll minimize the Hypershade, and this is the before render right here. I'm going to save it. Okay, this is the render without ambient occlusion. Now I'm going to render out with the ambient occlusion node just by clicking on render, because we've already spent quite a while setting up that custom shader graph. So here it goes. Okay, immediately you can see that there's a big difference wherever the ground meets up with any objects in the scene. If I go to the before render, which took 12 seconds to render, you can see that down here, just pay attention to this area here where the ground meets up with the rock. And now let's look at the after render, the render with ambient occlusion. See the difference? Before, after, before, after. So it looks darker and grittier, a bit grimier right there. These are contact shadows that are being created with the ambient occlusion shader. Now using ambient occlusion does add render time. As you can see, the before looks like this at 12 seconds. The after looks like this at 15 seconds. So we added about 3 seconds of extra rendering time, which really isn't that bad. I really can't complain. It's not much at all. And this looks pretty good. It looks much better than before, in my opinion. Okay. Now for the ambient occlusion node, there's a lot of different parameters we can change. The samples parameter controls the actual quality of the ambient occlusion effect. Now normally you would try to use samples of about 32 or 64, but that takes longer to render. Now we're only using 16 samples, but it still looks pretty good, the effect. The reason it looks good is because it's an optical illusion. The fact that we're using a terrain texture underneath that hides any possible artifacting. So if this texture was clean and white, we would be able to see artifacting down here in the way of small little speckles, little artifacts here, alright? Little graininess there with the ambient occlusion effect. But because the ambient occlusion effect is being composited on top of this dirt texture, it looks perfectly fine. So we really don't have to increase the samples to anything past the default, which is 16, which normally you would, but in this case, you don't have to. And we have a few different parameters here. We have a parameter like spread by default set at 0.8. I recommend you keep it at that. We can also change the bright and dark parameters here. So the bright is set to white. We want to keep it to white because if we don't, we can actually introduce some color here. And I don't want to introduce color. But just to show you how that works, I can go ahead and do this. Let's change it to red. And I'm going to do just render region of this area here. And you can see now how the terrain turned red. A very, very saturated bright red, which doesn't look very good. Now the reason it wasn't white before, even though this was set to white, is because it's compositing the colors. If we go here to the Hypershade, what's happening is that the multiply divide node is multiplying the values of the ambient occlusion over the values here of the Lambert shader. Very similar to the way that this layered texture is working. Remember we set it to multiply? Basically, it's multiplying the values. And the way that you want to multiply these values is using black and white as opposed to color, because once you introduce color, you're going to get all kinds of different colors in your scene, which might be what you want to do or it might not be. In this case, that's not what we want to do. So let's go ahead and open up the Ambient Occlusion Attribute Editor again. And the dark color is going to control the darks. So let's minimize the Hypershade here. Let's do another render region here. Back to the using the bright color set to white. Okay, so that's what it looks like right now. Let's save that image. Let's change the dark and let's make it about a mid-gray. So now the dark is going to be half as strong. And the dark color is those areas where there's those contact shadows. Basically that dark area is now going to be lightened up. So we can see here's the before with the dark color set at black, and here's the after with the dark color set at about a mid-gray. And here's the way before when we didn't have any ambient occlusion. Okay, so here it is with a little bit of darkening, and here it is with no ambient occlusion, and here it is with the default settings. So I'm going to leave it at the default settings. I think it's perfectly fine. Another thing that we can do is change the max distance. Okay, by default it's set to 0. When max distance is set to 0, that basically tells Mental Ray to sample the ambient occlusion forever for an unlimited distance. But we can actually change that. I could set the max distance to something like, say, 5 and render this out again. And now you notice that the dark areas are a little bit more limited. The darkness doesn't reach out as far as before. Okay, if I look at the before here, here's the before and here's the after. Here's an unlimited maximum distance where Mental Ray is sampling the ambient occlusion as far as it wants to. Okay, but we can actually limit that distance to about 5 or whatever distance you want, and that's actually going to shorten up that darkening right there like that, which actually looks pretty good in my opinion. I kind of like both of them, but this distance of 5 actually looks pretty interesting, looks pretty neat. I think I'm going to keep it at 5. Looks pretty cool. Okay, so you can put the distance to whatever you want. Something else that's interesting about distance is that it's a factor or it's a parameter of the ambient occlusion shader that optimizes the effect. So if I go to the before, you notice that the render time was 9 seconds. By limiting the distance to only 5, the render time got cut down by 1 second. The reason that happened is because when the distance is unlimited, Mental Ray has to make more calculations. When the distance is limited to a shorter distance, there's less calculations to have to be made, less ambient occlusion, and thus shorter render times. So it's important to keep aware of that and have good knowledge about that. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at 5. 5 actually looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close that attribute editor, and I'm going to say that I'm done with that. Okay, so now the ground terrain is complete. If we look at the Hypershade, we can see what we have. Quick summary here. We have a bump map, we have a cavity map, and a color map being composited, and then that's going into a Lambert shader. Then we have ambient occlusion, which is being multiplied by the Lambert shader, and the result of that multiplication, or that value, is going into this surface shader, the ground material here, and that's going straight into the shading group, and the shading group is giving that material information to the actual ground object. Now, one important thing here, you notice that the ground turned black in the viewport. Now, it's not broken, there's nothing wrong, it's going to render correctly, but that's just the way that the hardware texturing interprets it, so you're not going to be able to see the texture here. However, you notice here that the ground material is also black. That isn't exactly ideal. That might not be what you want. You might want to be able to see the ground material the way that you can see this Lambert shader here, or the way that you can see these color maps, like say the color map, the cavity map, and the bump map. So this can present to be a little bit of a problem, because if I go ahead and click on this 2-pane view here to show the top and bottom tabs, so I could see the tab on the top as well as the work area, here's the ground material. It just looks like this black circle. So right off the bat, even though it has the name, I might find it more convenient because I'm more of a visual person to see the color image in the swatch. So how can I fix that? Let me go back to a bottom view here of the work area. To be able to fix this is actually pretty neat. We can fix this. Let me move this over to the side like this. And I'm just going to go ahead and select the ground material here and hit F on the keyboard to frame in on it. I'm going to go over here to the render view window. We can actually do something really cool here. If we go up to the render menu here, or actually the view menu, I'm sorry, in the render view window, and you go to this option here, it says Grab Swatch to Hypershade Visor. What you can do is click on that once with the left mouse button, and now down here you'll see Maya says select a region and drag it to a swatch in Hypershade. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select and drag a region right here of the render, and I'm just going to go ahead and use the middle mouse button to click and drag and drop it on top of the ground material swatch here. And what happens is that now the swatch updated to the render that I chose, which is actually really cool, because now if I hit A, I can actually quickly see that that's the ground material. If I go back to a 2-pane view, I can quickly see here in the materials tab here of the Hypershade that the ground material looks like a ground texture, which is actually extremely useful and a very awesome way of visualizing your nodes here and your swatches. So it's a little trick there to help you out, just so that you can work with the Hypershade a little bit better. So instead of seeing that nasty black circle there, which just looks like a black hole, looks like nothing's there. Okay, so this works out a lot better. Okay, so I know this video has run long enough, but pretty much the hardest stuff of this tutorial is complete, of this chapter here. So now we finished that, I'm going to end this video here. And in the next video, we're going to go ahead and try to finalize this scene and set up the materials for the rest of the objects in this scene, like the wooden post, the aluminum tin can, and any other stuff that needs textures. Okay, so I'm going to end this video here, and I'll see you in the next one.